I wasn't supposed to be there long, just a week's worth of carpentry work. Fix the shelves, patch the cracked molding near the window, maybe tighten a few hinges. But the way she looked at me that first afternoon made it impossible to think about time the same way again. Her name was Elena, mid-40s, maybe older, but she carried herself like someone who'd already learned what most people my age were still fumbling toward: how not to waste words. Her voice was low and even, like a quiet note held too long. When she opened the door that day, the scent of cedar and coffee drifted out with her, and I remember wiping my boots on the mat as if I was about to step into something sacred. The house wasn't new. You could tell she'd lived in it long enough for the walls to start absorbing her rhythm. Books stacked on the floor, small cracks in the plaster, sunlight falling through old curtains in warm, forgiving angles. She walked me through each room, explaining what needed fixing. Nothing fancy, but every time she spoke, she touched the wood, her fingertips brushing across it like it might tell her something back. "You work with your hands," she said, not as a question, more like an observation. "Mostly," I answered. She nodded slowly. "Good. Wood remembers touch." I didn't know what that meant, but the way she said it made me want to understand. I spent most of that first day in her study, replacing a warped section of shelving. She moved quietly in the background, sorting papers, answering emails. Every so often, she'd pause behind me, too close, and ask if I needed more light. I'd say no, but she'd reach for the lamp anyway, her sleeve brushing against my arm. It wasn't deliberate, I told myself. Just space being space. Still, every time she leaned over, my chest tightened. Around noon, she brought coffee. No small talk, just placed it beside me and said, "You missed a spot." I looked up, confused, and she smiled. "On your hand." "Paint." When I glanced down, there was a faint white streak across my knuckles. I tried to wipe it off with my thumb, but she reached forward, caught my wrist gently, and used her own cloth instead. The touch lasted a heartbeat too long. I couldn't think of anything clever to say, so I didn't say anything at all. After that, the air in the room changed. We talked less, worked slower. When she did speak, her tone was softer, like she was listening for something under the silence. Once, she asked if I liked this kind of work, repairing what's broken. I said I did. She smiled again, faintly, like she didn't quite believe me. By the end of the day, the light outside had gone the color of honey, and I started packing my tools. She stood by the door, leaning against the frame, her hair tied up carelessly, a streak of dust on her cheek. "You'll be back tomorrow?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "If you still need me." "I do," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, "I like the sound of someone working in the house again." Something about the way she said it stuck. Not the words, the space between them. Like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. When I left, the scent of sawdust followed me down the driveway. My hands were rough, my shirt clung to my back, but all I could think about was the moment she caught my wrist. How still her hand had been. How she didn't let go right away. I told myself it was nothing. Just a strange, polite accident. But that night, when I lay awake replaying it, I realized it wasn't the touch that kept me up. It was the way she'd looked at me right before she did. Like she already knew what it would do. The next morning, the house was quieter than before. Even the old clock in the hallway seemed to tick with hesitation, like it didn't want to disturb whatever existed between us now. I'd come back to finish the shelves and start on the cracked doorframe in the hallway. She opened the door in a loose sweater, hair still damp, smelling faintly of rain. It had started to drizzle outside, leaving streaks of water on her window panes. "You're early," she said, half smiling, her voice carrying a trace of surprise. Or maybe she'd just forgotten what time she'd asked me to come. "Couldn't sleep much," I admitted. "Work anxiety?" I shrugged. "Something like that." She stepped aside and let me in, her bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. There was a tiredness about her that hadn't been there yesterday. Subtle, like the edges of her energy had frayed overnight. She moved slower, kept her arms crossed loosely over her chest, as if to hold something in. We worked mostly in silence. I fixed the door frame while she sat nearby with her laptop open but untouched. Every now and then, I'd hear her sigh quietly, then look away when she noticed me watching. She wasn't unfriendly, just somewhere else. Like her mind was balancing on a ledge she didn't trust herself to step back from. At one point, a loose nail slipped and grazed my palm. Nothing deep, just enough to sting. She noticed instantly. "You're bleeding," she said, getting up. "It's fine," I muttered, wiping it on my jeans, but she was already reaching for the drawer, pulling out a small first aid box. She took my hand without asking, turning it gently in hers. Her fingers were cool, steady. There was a tremor beneath her calm. Barely there, but real. "Hold still," she said softly, dabbing antiseptic on the cut. I tried not to move, but every nerve in my arm seemed to wake up under her touch. "You're good at this," I said quietly. She smiled without looking up. "When you live alone long enough, you get used to patching things yourself." There was a pause. The kind that doesn't need to be filled, but still aches to be. I could feel her breath near my wrist. When she finished, she didn't let go right away. Her thumb lingered, tracing just enough to make it mean something. She caught herself a second later, pulled back, turned toward the window. "You should probably wash up before you start again," she said. Her tone was steady, but her shoulders were tight. I watched her stare out into the drizzle, her reflection blurred in the glass. There was something in that posture, a quiet loneliness she was trying too hard to hide. I wanted to ask if she was all right, but she didn't seem like the kind of person who'd ever admit she wasn't. So instead, I just said, "You look tired." She glanced at me, surprised by the honesty. For a moment, something softened in her face. "I didn't sleep much either," she said, almost a whisper. "Sometimes the house feels too quiet." I nodded, even though I didn't know what to say to that. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full of things neither of us would name. Later, as I packed up for the day, she stood by the doorway again. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, "if you're up for it." She smiled faintly. "We'll see." But just as I stepped outside, I heard her call my name. When I turned, she didn't speak, just looked at me for a long second, like she wanted to. Then she closed the door gently, leaving that moment hanging in the rain. By the third evening, the rain hadn't stopped. It came down steady, soft, like it meant to stay. She'd called earlier that morning to ask if I could come by after dinner instead, something about meetings, deadlines. I didn't ask for details, just said yes, even though I knew it would mean working in the dark. When I got there, the house glowed faintly from a single lamp in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, sleeves rolled up, a glass of red wine half-finished beside her laptop. The air smelled like rain and varnish and something faintly floral I couldn't name. "You didn't have to come tonight," she said when I walked in. "I know," I said. "Didn't feel like staying home." She looked up at that, studied my face for a second longer than she needed to, then nodded. "All right then." The shelf in the hallway gave up again. I got to work while she sat nearby, scrolling through her phone, occasionally typing something. The storm pressed against the windows, steady and rhythmic. Every few minutes, thunder rolled in the distance, low and familiar. When the power flickered once, she stood and moved closer, as if proximity could keep the lights on. "You okay with storms?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Yeah, grew up with worse." "Lucky you," she said with a small laugh that didn't sound like one. "I still count the seconds between thunder and lightning." I smiled. "How many tonight?" She tilted her head, pretending to count, but her eyes lingered on me instead of the window. 3. Something about the way she said it, half distracted, half deliberate, made the air heavier. A minute later, her phone buzzed on the table. The sound cut through the quiet. She froze when she saw the name. Didn't answer, just stared at the screen until it went dark again. Then, almost too casually, she turned it face down. "Everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated. "It's just someone who used to call a lot." I didn't ask who. She didn't offer more. But her voice carried that small tremor I'd started to recognize, the one that slipped through when she forgot to be composed. We stayed like that for a while. Me pretending to focus on the repair, her pretending not to be waiting for another vibration that didn't come. When I finally stood up to test the shelf, she was right behind me. Too close. I turned, and she didn't step back. For a heartbeat, all I could see were her eyes, tired, alive, unsure. Her hair was loose now, a strand clinging to her cheek. I reached up before I could think, brushed it aside with my fingers. She didn't move, didn't breathe, maybe. The storm outside swallowed everything. Elena, I started, but she interrupted. You should finish up, she said, voice soft but not steady. It's late. I can stay until it's done. That's not what I meant. Her words landed somewhere between warning and confession. I could have said something, anything, but I didn't. I just nodded and stepped back, my hands still warm from where her skin had almost been. When I packed up to leave, she walked me to the door. Neither of us spoke. The rain had softened into mist. I reached for the handle, but she stopped me, her fingers brushing the back of my wrist, a ghost of that first day. Then she let go. Good night, she whispered. I stood there for a second longer, listening to her footsteps fade into the house. I didn't move until I heard the click of her bedroom door. The next day, she didn't call. I told myself I wouldn't either, that I'd wait until she reached out, but by mid-afternoon I found myself standing outside her gate anyway, toolbox in hand, pretending I'd just happened to be nearby. She opened the door before I could knock. No smile this time, just a quiet sigh, the kind that comes from someone who's already been arguing with themselves. You shouldn't be here today, she said. I know. Then why are you? I didn't have an answer that sounded right. Because the shelf. It's fine. She stepped aside anyway. But since you're here, the air inside was thick, stale. Curtains half drawn, a mug on the table gone cold. She looked like she hadn't slept. I set the toolbox down and didn't touch it again. For a while, neither of us said anything. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, tapping her thumb against the rim of the mug. It was almost unbearable, that silence, too heavy to be casual, too fragile to break. Finally, she said, You're making this harder than it needs to be. I didn't mean to. I know you didn't. She looked up then, and her eyes caught me, tired, distant, but not cold. You're young. You think closeness means you owe something to it. It doesn't always work that way. I don't think I owe you anything, I said quietly. I just don't want to keep pretending this doesn't feel like. I stopped. There wasn't a word for it that didn't sound foolish. She gave a sad half-smile. You think I don't feel it? Then why do you keep acting like I'm not here? Because you are, she said, her voice breaking just enough to show the truth beneath. And that's the problem. I leaned back, staring at the window where the light trembled across the glass. It doesn't have to be, I said, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. She shook her head. You don't understand. You still think this is about want. It's not. She rubbed her hands together, like trying to erase something invisible. It's about timing. About everything I've already broken that you don't even know about. Her words hit like cold water. For the first time, I saw it. The weight she carried that I'd mistaken for calm. The careful way she measured every breath. The way she kept me at a distance not because she didn't feel something, but because she did. I don't care about timing, I said, the words spilling before I could stop them. She met my gaze then, long and unblinking. You will. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then stopped. The house held its breath. I wanted to reach for her, to say something that would make her stay in that moment with me. But she looked down instead, and her voice came out in a whisper so quiet I almost missed it. You make me remember what it's like to want something I promised I was done wanting. There wasn't anything left to say after that. Just the sound of rain starting again, soft against the window, as if the world itself didn't know which one of us it was supposed to comfort. The next time I saw her, the air felt different. Not tense, just thinner, like the walls had learned to listen. She'd texted me that morning. If you're still free, I could use your help moving a few things from the attic. No greeting, no signature. Still, I went. She met me at the door with that same careful half-smile. Upstairs today, she said, leading the way. The wooden steps creaked under us, dust floating through narrow sunlight. It smelled of paper, cedar, and the kind of silence that holds history. Most of the attic was boxes, neat, labeled, untouched. I started moving them toward the stairs. She hovered nearby, pretending to help, but I could tell her attention was somewhere else. When I asked which boxes to take first, she pointed vaguely, then said, Wait. and reached for one I'd already lifted. "Not that one," she said sharply. Then softer, "Please." I set it down. She knelt beside it, brushing her fingers over the lid as if it were made of glass. "This one's old," she said. "I should have thrown it out years ago." "You don't have to," I said. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were photographs, some faded, some still sharp. A man stood in most of them. Late 20s maybe, dark-haired, the kind of easy grin that comes from never expecting to be left. In one photo, he was holding a child, smiling toward the camera. "That's my husband," she said, almost matter-of-factly. "He died 12 years ago." I didn't move, just waited. She didn't look at me, just kept flipping through the photos, one after another, until her hands stilled on a picture near the bottom. It was a younger version of her, laughing, windblown, alive in a way I'd never seen. "You remind me of him," she said quietly. "Not how you look, the way you talk, the way you listen." Her voice thinned, trembling at the edges. I thought I was over that kind of recognition. I didn't know what to say. Every word felt either too small or too big. So I just knelt beside her. The dust motes swirled in the air between us, catching the light like suspended time. "I'm sorry," I said finally, though I wasn't sure for what. His loss, my presence, or the fact that I didn't know how to be in that moment without wanting to reach for her. She shook her head. "Don't be. It's not your fault." A pause, then. "It's just strange. I spent years learning how to live without being seen. And then you showed up, hammer in hand, looking like you didn't mean to see me. And somehow you did." Her laugh broke halfway through, fragile and unsteady. "You have no idea how dangerous that is." I met her eyes, and something inside me shifted. Not attraction, not pity. Just understanding, heavy and simple. "Then maybe," I said, "we're both in trouble." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she reached into the box again, pulled out a single photo, and handed it to me. "Keep it," she said. "A reminder that what feels new isn't always new. Sometimes it's just something returning." I looked down at it. Her younger self, mid-laugh, sunlight in her hair. And when I looked back up, she was already walking toward the stairs. She didn't turn around, but her voice carried back through the quiet. "Don't let me make the same mistake twice." It was only later, standing alone in the attic, that I realized she hadn't said what the first mistake was. It was late when I went back, later than I should have. No text this time, no excuse. Just a quiet pull I couldn't reason with. Her lights were still on. Through the window, I could see her sitting at the table again, same as the first week. Only now her hair was loose, her face bare, her guard nowhere to be found. She looked up when I knocked, and for a moment I thought she might not let me in. Then she opened the door, stepped aside, and said, "You shouldn't keep doing this." "I know, but you're here anyway." "Yeah." She let out a slow breath and leaned against the doorframe. "You don't make this easy." "I don't think it's supposed to be." Something softened in her then. Not surrender, just exhaustion giving way to truth. She motioned for me to come inside. The house was dim, lit only by the kitchen lamp. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled like it. Wet earth, quiet aftermath. We didn't talk much. She poured 2 glasses of water, sat across from me, and just stared at her hands. The same hands that had fixed my cut, brushed against mine, built walls, and kept me out for weeks. They trembled now, almost imperceptibly. "I found the photo you left behind," she said. "You weren't supposed to keep it." "I know, but I couldn't." Her lips curved, barely. "You're too young to understand how heavy memory can be." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm old enough to know what it means when someone stops pretending they don't feel something." That made her look up. There was no anger in her eyes this time. No hesitation either. Just a kind of quiet knowing that left no room for denial. She pushed the glass away, stood slowly, and came to stand beside me. I could feel the warmth of her without her touching me. The air between us held the weight of every pause we hadn't filled. "I'm not what you think I am," she said. "I know," I whispered. Her hand hovered for a second before finding my face, fingertips barely grazing my jaw, like she was testing if I was real. I didn't move, didn't dare. The touch wasn't passionate. It was careful, reverent, almost afraid. A kind of love that understood its own limits. When her thumb brushed beneath my eye, she said quietly, "You remind me I'm still alive. That's not fair to you." "It doesn't have to be fair," I said. "It just has to be true." She laughed softly, a sound that trembled between relief and sorrow. Then she sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The silence between us said everything words couldn't. Outside, the night was finally still. The world felt paused, suspended in that narrow space where two people stop pretending they don't understand each other. Her head found my shoulder, almost by accident, and I felt her exhale, slow, unguarded, real. We stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing. The clock ticked quietly in the next room. Her hand brushed mine once, then stayed there, fingers lightly resting on my wrist. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "This can't last." "I know," I said, "but it's enough right now." And for the first time, it was. It's been almost a year since I left her house for the last time. The shelves I built are probably still there, straight, sturdy, quiet witnesses to a story that never really ended, just softened into memory. Sometimes I wonder if she still traces her fingers along their edges like she used to, feeling for something that isn't there anymore. I drive past that neighborhood now and then, slower than I should. The windows always look dark, but I can still picture the lights spilling out from her kitchen, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain against the glass. It's strange how a place can keep breathing in your mind long after you've stopped being part of it. People like to say some connections aren't meant to last. I used to think that was just a way to make loss sound poetic. But maybe that's what we were, something that didn't need to last to be real. She taught me that love isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about leaving before it turns into something smaller than it deserves to be. When I think of her now, it's never with regret, just quiet gratitude. She gave me something I didn't know I needed, a mirror, a kind of stillness. Being around her made me notice things I used to miss. The way hands tremble when holding back words, the courage it takes to look at someone and not look away, the beauty in restraint. She once told me memory was heavier than it looks. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Because carrying her isn't painful, it's just weight I've learned to balance. There's this one moment I can't forget. It wasn't our first touch, or even our last. It was a morning near the end. I was packing my tools, pretending it was just another day, and she was standing by the doorway, holding a cup she didn't drink from. She looked at me and said, "You fixed more here than you realize." I thought she meant the shelves. Maybe she did, but I think we both knew better. I left without looking back, because sometimes looking back makes things harder to keep pure. I told myself I'd forget, but some part of me hopes I never do. She became a quiet reminder of what love looks like when it's honest enough not to demand forever. I've worked on a lot of houses since then. Different rooms, different faces. But every time I pick up a piece of wood, every time the grain catches the light just right, I think of her voice saying, "Wood remembers touch." And maybe she was right. Maybe people do too. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?